morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's the second part of our discussion of the fashion in the long 19th century, and today I'd like to talk with you about the circulation of fashion, that is, the fashion magazines and how people knew what was fashionable. We'll talk about different artisans involved in the production of clothes, also different inventions that influenced the clothing industry. Also, we'll talk a little bit about the class system and the differences between social classes. So of course, in this semester we are mostly going to speak about the richer sections in the society, those who could afford to buy new clothes whenever something fashionable came out, but everybody wore clothes, not only the rich. So what would the regular people wear? Those who could not afford the novelties and expensive stuff. So first of all, between the beginning and the end of the 19th century appeared probably the most dramatic changes in the ways clothes were produced and bought. First of all, this is the industrialization of the 19th century, the technological developments in textile production, also the urbanization, so the same processes that influence everything in the 19th century, the industrialization and the urbanization. Technological development and the growing popularity of urban lifestyle, the growing relative prosperity of the people, so the expanding middle class, more people could afford luxury goods such as fashionable clothes. There is greater mobility and awareness of fashion through the growing literacy and growing circulation of the magazines devoted to clothes and other aspects of fashionable living. There is greater buying power and a wider range of goods available at affordable prices. One of the reasons for that is, of course, the mechanization of production. So towards the end of the 19th century, in the third quarter of the 19th century, we start having mass-produced clothing. So you could have new clothes that were not made to measure, that were not really made for you exclusively, so they were much cheaper than at the beginning of the 19th century, where there were only two possibilities. You either had the clothes made to measure, either by a professional, or if you were skilled enough, by yourself, or you had to do with second-hand clothes, and there was a huge market of second-hand clothes. So this is what the other half, or more than half, wore. So let's look at the details. Let's look at the tendencies here. So in the first half of the 19th century, there is really a continuation of traditional methods of tailoring and dressmaking. Everything was made by hand, so hand stitching was the only way to produce clothes. There was no mechanization yet here, and everything was made to measure by artisans. Only natural fibers were available, so wool, silk, cotton or linen mostly. Towards the very end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, we have the first man-made fiber, artificial silk, and around the middle of the 19th century we have first artificial colorings. So in the first half of the 19th century until the 1850s, any colors that you could have on your clothes were obtained from natural sources. These were natural, botanical mostly, colors. So this is the general situation. Another traditional aspect of making clothes was buying materials, trimmings and accessories. In the first half of the 19th century, they were as usual, so as it was traditional, they were bought from specialized tradesmen. There were specialized, usually quite small shops dealing with selling clothing materials, and usually they were specialized, so there would be a specialized shop selling woolen fabrics and another one selling linen and another one selling silk. These shops and these traders were usually called drapers. So you would go to a wool draper or a linen draper to buy your fabrics. Then you would go to another specialized shop called the milliners to buy the accessories. The term milliner comes from the name of the Italian city of Milan, which mostly in the 18th century, but it rests in place in the 19th century, was associated with fashion. Milan is still one of the great cities of fashion in Europe, so the term milliner to mean a shop with luxury products, with accessories, sometimes also hats, especially ladies' hats. This was a specialized shop. Of course, a shoemaker would make and sell shoes, very often made to measure as well, and the haberdasher would make and sell gloves. And gloves in the 19th century were as important as shoes. You wouldn't go out of doors, even in the summer, without wearing gloves. This was a mark of gentility. You wouldn't leave home without it, just as you wouldn't leave home without some sort of headwear. The specialized shops. There were also specialized artisans, the workshops that produce clothes. Generally, if we take needlework of any kind, this was the third major employment for women, after industry of any kind and domestic service. So most women in the 19th century had some skill with the needle, they had some training, but for different classes, the purpose of this training was different. For the upper class, needlework usually included a fashionable hobby, like embroidery, sometimes lace making, some sort of decorative needlework. There were different fads in the century. For example, for a while knitting was fashionable, or crocheting was fashionable. This was something that was considered ladylike and appropriate for upper class ladies to do in the evening, when they were just sitting in the drawing room alone, or often with friends or family, drinking tea. In the 19th century, it was generally considered bad manners to sit idle, so you would need something to occupy your hands. Needlework was a very good option here. For the middle class women, it would be more practical. They would be expected perhaps not to produce complete outfits, although many Victorian women were skillful enough to make their own clothes, but at least to mend the clothes if they got torn and to alter the clothes when the fashion changed. Usually middle-class women did not buy new clothes every season or even every other season. They had clothes that had to last for several years and accommodate such occurrences in life as pregnancies, the changes of weight. So if the lady lost some weight or took on some weight, the dresses would need to be altered, and also the changes in fashion. If the changes were not very dramatic, such as, let's say, the change from the crinoline to the bustle, but during the crinoline period, perhaps the trimmings, the decorations on the surface of the skirt might be different. You might add some ribbons, some lace decoration, some artificial flowers, or whatever else was fashionable at the time. So women were expected to be able to do such things themselves for their own clothes and for the clothes of their family, their husbands, their children. It was very popular for pregnant women to make, or at least to decorate, the first clothes of the baby themselves. The upper class ladies usually had a specialized servant, like a personal assistant called lady's maid, among whose duties was to mend and clean and look after the clothes, and whenever the fashion changed, the lady would just order a new dress or a new set of dresses. For the working class women, needlework was important as a potential additional source of income. In case a poor woman was widowed or otherwise it was necessary for her to earn her livelihood, becoming a seamstress, so becoming a needlewoman was always an option. So very often even poor girls had some basic training in needlework, this time really basic sewing rather than anything fancy. So in case they were facing destitution and starvation, and they, I don't know, might consider becoming prostitutes. This was the stereotype, really. We'll talk about it in a moment. They could always fall back on needlework. So most people, and I mean most people including the middle class, didn't have many changes of clothes. The poor might only have one, perhaps two changes of clothes. Middle class people would have 3, maybe up to 5 changes of everyday clothes. So they didn't really have large wardrobes. Rich ladies, aristocratic ladies, of course, were a different story. They might have more specialized costumes, and as you will see when we talk about the different styles, this becomes more specialized in time. So who made the clothes if not the women themselves? First of all, there were the tailors. The tailors were men, artisans, and they produced clothes for women, for men. So anything that men wore, especially the things made from wool, so trousers and coats and waistcoats, the basic elements of male garderobe were made by male craftsmen called the tailors. there was another category, another trade called the ladies' tailor. And the ladies' tailor was also most often a man who produced clothes for women, but they used the same fabrics as the fabrics most usually used for male clothes. So woolen fabrics rather than cottons or linens or silks that were perceived more feminine. So ladies' tailors would produce overcoats, so winter garments that were made of sturdier materials. The reason was mostly that before the mechanization it required more physical strength to actually draw the needle through the fabric. So they would produce also the so-called tailor-made costumes. The tailor-made costumes, we'll talk about it at a later stage, were a kind of daily attire that included a skirt and a matching jacket made of woolen fabric. It became quite popular for day wear towards the end of the 19th century, but before that, throughout the 19th century, this was a popular costume for horse riding. So this was expensive, this was usually very stylish and very up to date, and this required the skill of a lady's tailor because it was made of wool. Regular dresses, the majority of everyday dresses, were made by dressmakers, and dressmakers were usually women. They could cater for any budget. There were ateliers that were very modest, organized by one dressmaker or sometimes two sisters or friends having a small workshop together. There were, on the other end of the scale, very expensive and fashionable and prestigious ateliers that would later really develop in what you might call fashion designers. So one such atelier was the atelier of Charles Frederick Worth. He was an English ladies' tailor in Paris, and he opened a small shop in the 1850s, and his idea, which proved to be a complete win, was to combine two operations: the buying of the materials and having them made up into garments. Because before, if you lived in a small town, let's say, and you wanted to have a new dress made, you would first go to a draper's store to buy materials, and then you would go to a ladies' tailor, or more often to a dressmaker, to have your measurements taken and to have the clothes actually made. That's kind of going in and out. Yes, she's back. That's a cat assistant called Kiciuncik. Yes, Kiciuncik. Oh, no, she's not happy. Okay, you can go. So, yes, out. And the innovation of Worth's atelier was to combine these two things, buying materials and having them made. This proved to be extremely successful. The shop grew very quickly. He employed 50 people to make the clothes. At the end of the 19th century, his firm, of course run by his descendants, employed more than 102,000 people. So this was already in the time when the craftspeople were replaced greatly by department stores, and the market for ready-made clothes rather than the clothes that were made to measure. We'll talk about it when we talk about the styles of the second half of the 19th century. So we have the tailor, the lady's tailor, the dressmaker, we have the milliner who sold hats and accessories, and we have the seamstress who would make anything made of cloth, usually underwear. And if you know anything about 19th century fashion, they wore a lot of underwear, and we'll talk about it in greater details next week. But there were many layers of underwear worn by women, and also some elements of clothing like shirts that are now not really regarded as underwear, so they could be worn without any further layers of clothing. In the 19th century, no gentleman would be seen ever wearing only his shirt, without a waistcoat and a coat. So if you think about all those films and TV series set in the 19th century with all those beautiful, sexy men dressed in white shirts and looking hot, this is the projection. This is fan service, nothing more. No men in the Regency period or in the Victorian period or any time in the 19th century would be seen in his shirt only anywhere out of his bedroom. So this is really the contemporary directors trying to cater for the tastes of contemporary viewers. So the seamstresses would make the shirts, and this is something that was much discussed in culture, even popular culture. In 1843, a man called Thomas Hood published a poem entitled The Song of the Shirt, which presented the sad life of a poor seamstress. So I have a fragment here. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger and dirt. And still, with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the song of the shirt. So here we have a poor woman, working class woman, probably one of those facing destitution, who had to turn to needlework to provide any kind of income for their families. But a poor seamstress became something of a stereotype in Victorian culture. She was the worthy poor, the kind of poor person who deserved, according to the Victorian values and middle class morality, she deserved public help because she was honest, she was hardworking, she never turned to prostitution or anything like that. She tried to make an honest living. So there are quite a lot of paintings and other images showing the image of a poor seamstress. Otherwise, this could be quite a problem. So here we have the different artisans, and let's now talk a little bit about inventions. So as anything in the 19th century, there was a steady wave of improvement through technology, also including the production of clothes. For example, in 1823, a man called Charles Mackintosh patented a method of making waterproof fabric. The idea was to sandwich a layer of rubber between two layers of cloth to make the cloth waterproof. This could be used, for example, for overcoats. So a Macintosh became synonymous with an overcoat made of this new fabric. There were new industrial methods of cutting through many layers of cloth at the same time, and the mechanized production, which really led to the big market for ready-made clothes in the second half of the 19th century that would be sold in the department stores. But probably the greatest invention to influence daily lives of the Victorians, especially the middle-class Victorians, was the sewing machine. This was something that became almost ubiquitous. The first patent for a sewing machine appeared in the 1840s, so around the middle of the 19th century. A very popular model was patented by an American producer, Isaac Merritt Singer, and the Singer machine really became synonymous with a domestic sewing machine. Mr. Singer brought his invention to the Great Exhibition in 1851, so everybody could see it, and soon enough the machines were able to be bought in hire purchase, so you would pay in installments. They became very popular for middle-class women, and they really made it possible for middle-class women to produce and mend their clothes. And we continue in a moment.